Welcome to Issues with Noah Rothman on Two-Way. I'm your host, Noah Rothman. And today, we're going to begin with the zombified notion of the GOP establishment. If you're of a certain age, you've heard the term, now almost exclusively used as an epithet, quite a lot. You have to be of that age to know what it refers to. In a pre-Trump era, the establishment, quote unquote, described, well, an establishment. Republican lawmakers, donors, appointed officials, and even rank-and-file voters who backed the party wherever it went. And where it went was usually in the direction of candidates who were perceived to be the most electable in their respective districts or states. However, electability was defined in those respective districts and states. Moreover, they were lawmakers devoted to getting things done in Washington. The knock on them in the pre-Trump era was that these were bridge builders who lacked the will for a fight, necessarily because they were attempting to create consensus across the aisle. They were too willing to court their political opponents, the assault on them rhetorically went, and in the process, they gave up their principles. Over time, that case has won the argument with Republican voters. The old guard is no more. So what has been replaced in the Republican Party with the old establishment gone when they aren't replaced with Democrats? They've been replaced with lawmakers who privilege the fight, even at the risk of getting very little done in Washington, D.C. And yet, the phrase is still routinely bandied about to describe something its users apparently think is real. They seem to believe it describes a bulwark of surreptitious Republican operatives working behind the scenes to thwart the will of a popular majority. Indeed, they have been behind the scenes. They have to be, because the representatives of the GOP who are establishmentarian are very hard to find out in the open now. If there was an establishment today, it's Donald Trump and those in the Republican Party who follow his lead. He sets the agenda, he defines the terms of debate, and he describes what constitutes electability in his mind and therefore in the mind of Republican voters. He and his faction dominate Congress, the party campaigns and committees, and its outside groups. Republicans who insist on retaining this formula to describe Republicans with whom they disagree may regard this as a semantic debate, but it is not, or at least it shouldn't be. Calling things by apt descriptors is a valuable rhetorical enterprise, if nothing else. And defining our terms is likely to become something of a more important ideal if Donald Trump does not win the presidency in November. It's debate we're going to be having for a long time. Even though we're having it now, especially following this week's Republican primaries in places like Ohio. So for more on this and to help me navigate this thorny environment, I'm very pleased to be joined by my two guests today. First, Danielle Pletka, a senior fellow with the American Enterprise Institute and the host of What the Hell is Going On podcast with her co-host Mark Thiessen. Hi, Danielle.
Hey.
And David Drucker, who's a senior writer with the Dispatch and a regular on all Dispatch media products, including the Dispatch podcast, of which I am a regular listen to. David, thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be here. Thank you.
So let's start with David, something that you and your colleagues over at the Dispatch wrote earlier this week. John McCormick, who I should note as a National Review senior writer myself, is dead to us. We no longer speak that name. Jonathan used to be part of the team, and he went over to the Dispatch where he does fine work. And Michael Warren, who wrote up a fascinating pre-write of the Senate primary this week in Ohio featuring several candidates, some of whom were fairly representative avatars of the competing factions in the GOP. Matt Dolan is a state representative, enjoyed a late surge in the polls. He was a favorite candidate of Governor Mike DeWine, Ohio governor, and former Senator Rob Portman, the kind of folks we used to call establishment, but now are, I suppose, establishment in exile. And Bernie Moreno, who won the primary with more than 50% of the vote, who seems to represent a more insurgent side of the party, or at least that was what we would describe him as in the status quo ante, the earlier years. But it's hard to say that he's not establishmentarian now, given the degree to which he could count on some of the most important and influential forces within the Republican Party. Ohio's Trump territory. Moreno won. David, this tells us little about the state of the GOP, save that it both defers to Donald Trump's judgment and that it likes its politics kind of entertaining, at least a little spicy, perhaps too much for my tastes. Does this tell you the same, or was the late Dolan surge indeed kind of outperforming expectations, an indication that the more moderate wing of the party just has a little bit of fight left in them?
Well, look, I think first of all, at the end of the day, Bernie Moreno really won this primary in a landslide. And so while I know from reporting that the Moreno campaign was concerned that Dolan could win, it turns out Dolan wasn't very close. And I think what we saw in the Republican Senate primary in Ohio is indicative of what we've seen in the presidential primaries on the Republican side over the past couple of months, which is, and you alluded to this, the old divide between the populist wing of the Republican coalition and the governing wing, the establishment wing, as we used to call them, has been
We
flipped
need
on
a
its
new
head.
term. I'm fishing for a new term.
It's been, yeah, and I'm not sure what to do with this yet. It's been flipped on its head. The populist wing was the junior partner. The governing wing, the establishment wing, the consensus wing, at least consensus among Republicans, was the dominant faction. And now the dominant wing, led by Trump, at least as constituted by Trump, as long as he's at the head of the top of the pecking order, is the populist wing. And that old Reaganite wing is now a minority faction. And I think what you saw in Ohio was just that. There's still a healthy faction by the numbers of Reaganites, of more traditional conservatives, right? Limited government, probably hawkish on national security, or at least believe in American global leadership. And but then you've got the populist wing, the Trump wing, that's dominant. There's just more of them, at least as long as the party is being led by Trump. Now, the interesting thing about this, no, and by the way, I don't think it's any more complicated than that, other than, yeah, we got to come up with a new name for the establishment, because Donald Trump, as you just said, he is the establishment. There is a Republican establishment. It's just no longer the people that used to be the establishment. It's the people that used to be on the outside looking in. So that's the only thing that's changed. So yeah, let's come up with a name for this other faction. I usually my shorthand is Reaganites in conversation, but we need something that might be more broadly understood by a casual reader or listener. Here's the thing, though, and this is really interesting. Donald Trump can be very transactional at times. And so in some cases, he will he will endorse candidates in Republican primaries. Let's say the Arizona Senate primary, like Kari Lake, right? I mean, she is as Trumpy as it gets. She's more Trumpy than Trump. And this is how she expresses her loyalty to him and keeps him doing her favors. But Bernie Moreno is not a Kari Lake. He's not even a J.D. Vance. He's a former harsh Trump critic, made his money the old-fashioned way. He earned it as an auto dealer, and he has a great American story. And his temperament is that of a governing wing conservative. But what he has done to get ahead in a Trumpified Republican Party is kiss the ring. And he has also taken certain positions that he must take in order to keep Trump's wing happy, because they don't always do everything he wants. But he is not necessarily temperamentally or on every policy issue a carbon copy of Trump. And he is, so far, in my estimation, far from a J.D. Vance.
So, Danny, that's really interesting. First, if you want to submit a name, a term here, we're running a contest. I will take your submissions. But to David's point, Democrats put their thumb on the scale in this one. And they have been doing that for a while, trying to boost candidates who they believe are more less electable to their electorates than a more establishmentarian candidate, for lack of a better word. But they might regret it in Moreno's case. I mean, they haven't yet. They've been doing this roughly since 2010. And sometimes they make mistakes. Sometimes they back candidates like, for example, Donald Valadao, who won, and the attempt to boost Ron Hanks last cycle in Colorado ended up not being successful. But then they have success stories like what happened with Pennsylvania gubernatorial candidate Doug Mastriano, really boosting him in ways that he couldn't count on himself with his lack of resources. So that's the success story, and all they hear are success narratives. But Moreno is now running for a statewide office in a very red state, turning redder. He has cornered the market on the rhetorical approach to politics that sort of ditches conservatism's green eye shades, really appeals to a more industrial, post-conservative or populist approach to politics. And he's going up against somebody who has a lot of those very same views in the form of Sherrod Brown, despite Senator Brown's, has a pretty good relationship with his voters and has been in that seat since I think 2007. He nevertheless, the two of them don't have a whole lot in the way of policy particulars in economic terms that they would distinguish themselves from. And that's really the case that Democrats are comfortable making against Republicans. They're deprived of that here. They're going to have to make a cultural case. But that doesn't seem to be a great fit for Ohio. If there's an upside to this situation, Danny, it would be that this strategy finally backfires on Democrats in a way that they can't escape from, in a way that the media comes down around Democrats and says, you boosted this guy, you cost us a winnable seat, stop doing this. Do you see that happening?
Well, I mean, we've seen it happen. And that's why the Democrats keep pouring money into it. That's why, look, there are two different kind of new establishment, and maybe that's what we need to call them. They're the new establishment. I called them, in a piece I wrote, I called them the neo GOP, not the OG GOP. You're right, the OG GOP is the Reagan GOP, right? And the neo GOP is those Trumpy characters. But I think it denigrates both the movement behind Trump, the reason Trump won the election, which he did in 2016, and the reason he may win the election in 2024 is that there's something here, right? And the problem for the Democrats is that they don't get what that is, right? They are acting like trolls. Yeah, you guys are scum. We're going to back you. No one will vote for you. You're going to be the great opponent, and then you're going to lose, and our guy's going to, rumble to victory. And that happened in Pennsylvania. That happened elsewhere. That was a great strategy. It may well work for them elsewhere, but it does sort of spit in the face of people who are voting for a reason, and it's not the kiss the ring reason. Okay, there are people who are there because they kiss the ring. Kari Lake's a good example. Kristi Noem's working really hard to be that person. We can name a really long list of people who are, kiss the ring people. But there are people who are in that space because they recognize that that is where the opposition party is headed. And let's face it, that's where the Democratic Party is headed too. The difference between Trump and Biden is much less different than the Democrats want to admit. And where those differences are, they're not on style, right? They're not on manners like they used to be. They are on cultural issues, right? They are on immigration, but they're not on some of the key economic issues that we talk about. And so again, for me, this is a much more complex thing than people want to admit. It's not just trolls versus really great people. It's not just gross, kiss the ring, Trump won in 2020 people versus honorable Democrats. It's a much more complex thing. And people who are riding that genuine underlying wave of people who are really unhappy with the economy, who are really unhappy with inflation, who are really unhappy with their wages, who actually recognize that the America that they live in isn't the same America that they wanted to live in. They're a real phenomenon, and to denigrate them as Trump voters, as trolls, is unfair. So it's actually deeper and more interesting than a lot of people want to admit.
You've both mentioned Kari Lake, and I think that's important as it relates to the Republican Party Senate prospects this year. They've been talking up the prospects in this cycle for a long time. It's a good map as maps go. They have pickup opportunities in places like Ohio, as we've discussed, in Arizona with Kari Lake, and in Montana, where John Tester is very vulnerable. But they have rough candidates now. Bernie Moreno has not performed in head-to-head polls against Sherrod Brown as well as Matt Dolan did. Kari Lake is running behind Donald Trump's performance in the state of Arizona, according to the polling. So the bad candidate thing does haunt them as much as it haunted them in 2022. It haunts them now. However, there's a bright side in the form of Larry Hogan running for the Senate in Maryland, who's polling quite strongly. That would, David, this would be a source of profound cognitive dissonance for Republicans who would owe the prospect of potentially retaking the chamber, if Larry Hogan were to pull it out, to one of those squishy establishmentarian types, no?
Well, there's nobody else that could win in Maryland. And so far, Trump's been kept at bay from criticizing Larry Hogan, even though Hogan has been very clear that not only has he never supported Trump in a presidential election, he won't be doing it this year, even though he's going to be the guy on the ballot. And even though, as in all blue states, there is a Republican base, and even though it's smaller than in red states, it's there, and it's as basey as bases get, right? But it seems like everybody for now is playing nice because they recognize they may have a unique opportunity to win a race that they have no business winning. I would say that over time, if Hogan's numbers persist, and the Democrats have to get through a primary of their own before they can coalesce and focus on Hogan, the Democratic Party will dump money on Hogan's head. They'll make this, I'm sure, an issue of who gets to appoint and confirm judges in the United States Senate.
Oh, that's okay. Well, hang on. This is a real test. Does the Republican Party reciprocate? Do the Republican committees reciprocate?
Well, yeah, but to me, it's less material because voters in Maryland are more inclined to vote Republican for governor because it doesn't deal with all of these thorny federal and constitutional issues. And so they can say, you know what? I think you, Larry Hogan, you could do a great job running our state. But when you have a blue state with concerns about access to abortion and other issues, they're going to look at this differently. I'm from California originally. I saw this all the time where we would elect Republicans for governor, but Republicans running for Senate could get nowhere near victory, even in really good Republican years, because voters are pretty smart and they can hold two ideas in their head, which is our state's being poorly run. Why don't you go rein in the legislature and do a better job? But I don't want you going to the United States Senate where you're going to support the confirmation of judges that are going to rule in ways that are against my policy and cultural interests. And so before we get ahead of ourselves, all I am saying is it could be a great opportunity for Republicans, and it will be interesting to see if Trump will hold his tongue the more Larry Hogan has to reassure everybody that he's not going to support Trump. But even if he does so, watch the Democratic Party over time, if they need to, pour money and advertising on Larry Hogan's head to bring down his favorables and remind Democratic voters in Maryland that a vote for Hogan for the United States Senate is not the same as a vote for Hogan for the governor's mansion.
All right. Lastly, on this topic, I want to get you guys on something that has been just vexing me over the last several months now. What to make of Donald Trump's 20% problem, if it's a problem at all. There's a reliable protest vote in the Republican primaries, and it conflicts with head-to-head polling between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, which shows Donald Trump counting on fully 90% or more of Republican voters. But as the primaries have demonstrated, including those this week in Ohio, Florida, Kansas, and Illinois, that complicates this narrative. You can't attribute the votes for Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis and even unaffiliated to open primary dynamics entirely, or early voting in which voters cast a ballot for Nikki Haley when she wasn't in the race anymore. That's especially true in Florida, where neither apply. Where Donald Trump is counting on about 80% of the vote and roughly a 20% protest vote. In Kansas, he won just 3/4 of the vote, which is a lot, but it's shoddy performance for a quasi-incumbent. So what gives here? The thing that I keep leaning into to try to address my cognitive dissonance here is that Republican voters are telling pollsters that they want to come home, that this is a protest vote, but they, insofar as they still identify with the Republican Party, it's an aspiration to vote for the top of the ticket in November, and they need a reason to do so. But neither Donald Trump nor the Republican Party he commands seems especially interested in appealing to these voters. They're kind of taking them for granted, and they also assure themselves, when they're not in mixed company, that they can remake the electorate in their image, and they don't actually even need this contingent of voters. Danny, am I just overanalyzing this situation? Is it meaningful in any way? There's a lot of resistance among people in our line of work here who are on the right side of the aisle to the notion that there's any durable protest vote against Donald Trump in the Republican Party. We dare not speak it in public, but I find this persistent phenomenon to be something worth exploring.
So, I mean, you're asking a smart question, right? Are people who voted for anybody other than Donald Trump in the primary going to come home to the party? And when they walk into that voting booth in November and they see two, I don't want to say serious, because of course that
relatively
makes fun of us, the voter, right? Well, geez, when I have to compare Robert F. Kennedy and the Green Party to Trump and Biden, I'm lost. Who is more serious there? I have no damn idea. But at the end of the day, we're faced with two candidates, and we're faced with what economists call a binary sort. So does the party come home? I think for the most part, people who know this much better than I do will tell you they do come home. But I think there's an even more important point here, which is that we are, we especially, we as mostly conservatives are focused on Donald Trump, who isn't pandering, isn't looking, isn't talking to independents, isn't seeking to woo Democrats, he's a really base guy. What's interesting, and what I think gets missed by the mainstream media and to a certain extent by those of us who don't love Donald Trump, is that Joe Biden is doing exactly the same thing. I watch the choices that he's making in recent weeks, the speeches he's making. Hey, fossil fuels, automobiles, right? They should go. Well, on our podcast today, we had Gary Killen, the former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, and he was like, "So let me get this straight. You're worried about Michigan, but you're worried about Michigan because of the Arabs and the Palestinians. You're not worried about alienating the auto workers with this whole idea." So, Biden is equally problematic in pandering to his base, and the cultural problems, the immigration problems, which are now, and the economic problems that are number one, number two, and number three on the list of concerns of voters. He's not giving an inch on those things. So he's not making any room, and Donald Trump is not making any room. And so if you walk into the voting booth, fundamentally, you're going to be asking yourself, forgive me for, plagiarizing here, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? And for a lot of voters, the answer is going to be hell to the no.
Yeah, David, to the 20% thing there, and Joe Biden's outreach efforts, such as they are, which seem to be limited to, hey, there's room for you guys over here, and that's it. No, absolutely no other concessions to be made. They have to be looking at the same data that we are, probably at a more granular level. So, I mean, it would speak well of the protest vote if the Biden campaign is looking at this contingent and saying, there's no space for them in our coalition. They're not persuadable. They are Republicans. They are conservatives. They're just not Trump voters. Is that what we're looking at?
Well, I think we need to give the campaign more time to unfold. I think it's very true that Joe Biden has more coalitional pressures than Donald Trump. We focus on one particular coalitional pressure that Trump has, and that's this faction of the party that does not like him and that does not like many of his policies on the issues that matter to them. The coalition for a long time worked because you had Republicans at the top of the ticket that were fiscally conservative and believed in American global leadership. they were culturally conservative, but the suburban vote, the voters that weren't in this for gun rights and because they were pro-life could look past all of that because they had something they wanted. And I think with Donald Trump, you don't have a small government conservative. He's an aggressive deregulator, but he's not a small government conservative. He doesn't believe in reducing spending, and he doesn't believe in American global leadership. He believes in using American power at times, but he doesn't believe in American global leadership. And so he's less attractive to the Reagan coalition, the Reagan faction of the coalition. However, there's another issue here, and this is really problematic. And I spoke to a lot of voters in my reporting for the Dispatch as I traveled the country covering the primaries. A lot of these voters may in the end come home because they're conditioned to vote Republican. They want to vote Republican. And Joe Biden philosophically and on issues that matter to them doesn't really appeal to them, right? They just have fundamental disagreements. And if you've covered Joe Biden throughout the breadth of his career, he's never been a centrist. He's never been a moderate. He's just a nice guy compared to Donald Trump, and that's it, right? And so
even that's pretty debatable.
Well, it depends on how you look at it, but that is why he was referred to as a centrist in the 2020 campaign, as if nobody recognized where Joe Biden has been on issues his entire career. But the issue here for Republican voters that have been logging these protest votes long after Nikki Haley was out of the race is that they don't think Donald Trump is a good guy, and they don't feel welcome in the party, even aside from Trump. And I've talked to these voters about that. You have your issues with Trump. Aside from Trump, do you feel welcome? Do you think that the Republican Party, as constituted under Trump, is tolerant of you? Do they want you? And a lot of these voters have said, among my close personal friends, we found a way to get along. But I don't talk politics with anybody else, because I don't think they want me and I don't want to get into fights. And by the way, this is a problem because in order to go home, why do voters always go home? Well, because at the end of the day, I tend to agree with you and basically you're a good guy. You're not who I wanted, but you're fine. They don't think that about Trump and they don't necessarily feel that way about the party. And so they may all go home in the end, but a significant portion of them may not, and we just don't know yet. And to Danny's point, what is Joe Biden offering them? I'm really curious to see if Biden is at least going to throw them a bone, just something other than I'm not going to kill democracy, which, by the way, does matter to these voters to some degree. But is he going to throw them some bone as a way to say, not only do I welcome you, but I'm going to give you a parting gift for showing up to my party? I don't know that they're going to do that given the serious coalitional pressures they have with young voters, with various faction cohorts of non-white voters, and they're trying to sort this out. But it would be interesting to see if they get to that point.
Yeah, even a gesture of hostility towards the progressive left, a theatrical and cosmetic one would.
No, I just want to point out, and this isn't the bone that Joe Biden needs to throw at them, but I still need to point out. All right, I'm a Cold War kid. I'm in my early 50s. The idea that Joe Biden, if I went back in time and told myself in 1985, because I was kind of a political nerd, that in the year 2024, Joe Biden will be president and he will quote Ronald Reagan at his State of the Union address approvingly, I would have said you're crazy, because as beloved as Reagan was and all the landslides he won and all that stuff, Democrats hated him. They hated him.
And so Joe Biden hated him.
Yes. And so, by the way, it just kind of shows you how our politics has in some ways been turned upside down when you're more likely to get something like that from Joe Biden than you are from Trump. I mean, they all say peace through strength, and it's become a cliche, but to quote Ronald Reagan on foreign policy, probably more likely to hear it these days from Biden than Trump. Not enough of a parting gift if you want to get these Haley voters, but it was very interesting to me.
Yeah, both of those conditions are from the Republican side and the Democratic side are bewildering. So Danielle had said the Trump message, and he's broadcast this himself, is, are you better off 4 years ago than, or are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? And for most of us, the answer was no. not exactly 4 years ago. We've been sort of doing retrospectives this year, now that it can be told, on the COVID pandemic and how we responded to it. And the New York Times had a big story in my world this week in which they finally conceded that remote learning and the efforts to mitigate the spread of the virus in the schools did a lot more damage than they helped. The Times report, quote, remote learning was a key driver of academic declines during the pandemic. They note that there were, quote, no easy decisions at the time. You know, officials had to weigh the risks of an emerging virus against the academic and mental health of the students, but they did weigh those risks and they decided against the students. Kids fell behind across the board. Kids with fewer resources in poorer districts and poorer schools fared worse. The mental health problems incepted by this forced atomization have only gotten worse with time. And now it can be admitted. So yes, it's a little gauche to take a victory lap here. Those of us who were critics of this experiment early on, especially those of us who had school-aged children and were dealing with the horrors of remote learning and hybridization. But we all deserve a lap around the track, at least one. David, the worst part about this piece, from my perspective, was not that they were making this admission way too late and that we all know what the admission was eventually going to be now that it's finally upon us. But the architects of this, our torment, are totally unrepentant. They quote a Philadelphia Federation of Teachers president, Teachers Union, Jerry Jordan, who says the following: I do believe it was the right decision to close schools. Quote, it doesn't matter what's going on in the building and how many people are learning if people are getting the virus and running the potential of dying. But that's what we learned in retrospect here, that whole attempt at emotional blackmail was wildly overblown. And it was accompanied with unions hectoring and blackmailing parents and insisting that anybody who wanted their schools open also wanted teachers to die, and teachers holding sick outs and even illegally striking in places like Chicago. And Rochelle Walensky, who was the CDC head, saying during the transition period in 2021, early 21, or even late 2020, that the conditions to open the schools now were present. And only later did she receive an education in the constituent maintenance that Democrats had to perform, where she said, well, we need a lot more resources in order to get the schools safe. At which point they were provided. Billions of resources were provided to these schools, and it was never enough. And even today, there's leftover funds appropriated for the COVID relief situation. And they have the temerity to say it's a fiscal cliff now, that those funds are at the risk of being reclaimed, unspent funds are at the risk of being reclaimed by the Congress. This tells me, David, that this is all going to happen again. Maybe not this particular situation, maybe not a pandemic, maybe not even this, or the COVID-19, or even a virus, but something will emerge that will convince progressives that they can strong arm and hold hostage public school parents because they have learned zero lessons.
Well, a couple of things here. I'm sympathetic to the steps that were taken to prevent the spread of the virus in real time because we didn't know anything about it. Now,
yeah, I was too. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I was too, and I wrote as much in March. But by April of 2020, it was readily apparent that the experiment was a failure, and it persisted for the next 18 months.
Listen, I have school-age children, so I lived this. And by the time I got to the summer, I was done with it. But here's my point. I am sympathetic to the decisions made in real time about a virus we didn't know anything about because the fear was so palpable that things could get even worse because of all the things we didn't know. What matters today is that we know a lot. We don't only know that remote learning was very detrimental to children. We know that it was not necessary. We know this because we've been through it. And so what's important is that should this happen again, we take the lessons learned. What I would say, and listen, this is just my speculation because we can't know if and until it happens, because so many parents went through this and they learned. I don't think it will be as easy for school districts or state, local, and federal governments to create the same conditions again because parents now are aware of what it means. They're aware of how it impacts their children, and they'll be much more aware of what's necessary and what isn't, where we were all living through this and we were all unsure. And listen, you and I are in the news business. I was trying to gather information because that, my job, I didn't have to go do something else. I was paid to read all day, and report. And I still had a hard time figuring things out. I still remember all of the different, no, the problem is this. No, the problem is that. No, the problem is the other thing. So I think that because we've learned so much and because parents are so aware of what their kids went through, this knowledge will stick with us, and if this doesn't happen for another 100 years, well, that's even better.
Yeah, well, it could be a pandemic that forces us, or some sort of a viral threat that forces us to reconsider the value of this sort of approach, or it could be many other social phenomenon. It's a failure of imagination to not think of the ways in which Democrats could decide, well, we need to re-implement emergency measures because they have an emergency that fixates them. Danny, the insurance for what David talks about would be raw electoral votes, an electoral backlash. And we got that in 2021 in Virginia and New Jersey. That was a COVID election, and it went the wrong way for the Democratic Party. Very nearly took the gubernatorial office in New Jersey, definitely took a lot of legislative seats in Virginia and New Jersey, and the governor's mansion in New Jersey. But it fizzled in 2022, and it was still with us because Republicans didn't make that case. Republicans, particularly in open races, nominated a lot of candidates who made the race about themselves, about their personality, and ultimately, to voters, according to their verdicts, unpalatable to the voting public, who were not happy with the COVID status quo and probably willing to send a message to the Democrats who engineered this phenomenon. But that wasn't what Republicans retailed. And I suspect that moment is behind us, never to be reclaimed. Republicans aren't making the case now that a pandemic reckoning should be a valuable enterprise. Ron DeSantis attempted it in the primary and didn't even get Republican votes on this thing, on that message, saying, I'm the anti-COVID governor. I'm going to make everybody account for what they did during that period. I just think the time is behind us. And I just don't think Democrats will have learned any lessons as a result, unless they suffer electorally directly attributable to their approach to the pandemic.
I confess, no, I'm confused. First of all, I have 4 children. It's not confusing to me that in-school learning is better than remote learning. It's certainly not confusing to me that that asynchronous learning is garbage and that synchronous learning is better. Of course, only kids in private and parochial schools got synchronous learning.
Can you describe that? Can you define what synchronous versus asynchronous?
Of course. So, right. So you go to school, all of us remember great moments, right? First period, second period, third period, recess, lunch, whatever that was. Synchronous learning meant that you got on, just like we 3 are on, and you were with teacher A in first period, teacher B in second period, teacher C in third period. You went and had your lunch with your mom in lunch period. You went and played with the dog in recess, and then you came back and you had math or science in D and E and F. And so you had what was called synchronous learning. When you had asynchronous learning, it meant that you didn't have a class schedule. You would sometimes meet with teacher A or sometimes meet with teacher B, but mostly you would have just, you teach yourself, or you could get a video, or we'll tell you what the assignment is, and maybe you'll do it and maybe you won't. And that's how the public schools ran things. And if you didn't have the resources, or you weren't a serious parent and could take your kids into tutoring, you basically got no education for 2 years, honestly speaking. And we saw both sides of this. Most of our kids went to public school. Our last kid, luckily during COVID, went to private school, and we saw the difference because a lot of our friends had kids still in public school. And by the way, in one of the best public school systems in the country, in Fairfax County. There's no confusion about this. We know what happened. It was obvious that it was bad. And I don't give a damn whether there's an electoral reckoning or not. My job is not to punish my representatives to do this. My job is to understand what the lessons here are and to try to fix this. And what the fixes are here are that minorities, right? The poor, the disenfranchised. Those were the people who suffered the most from this. And the main reason they suffered the most from this is because government insisted on this, and because the teachers' unions and Rachel Walensky insisted on this. The notion that the Swedish government was smarter than we are, I'm sorry, not to sound like a chauvinist American pig here, but the Swedish government got this, kept schools open, and not lost not a single child in that first year when we were so confused about what was happening, and lost not a single teacher out of sync with the losses in the rest of the professional population. Okay, it was obvious at the time. We didn't want to believe science. And again, we got bullied. And this is part of the resentment that people feel, is not, I want to punish you for not educating my kids. I want to punish you for making me wear a mask when I didn't feel like this, the Ron DeSantis argument. It is the resentment that is felt towards the establishment. It is the resentment that is felt towards so-called experts. It is the resentment felt towards the government for telling us to do things that we didn't want to do, that fuels that populist anger. And you may not want to tie it to COVID, and that's fine, but do not deny that this is part of where it comes from. And this is the problem that we face. And if we don't have a reckoning, you can call it a 9/11 commission, you can call it whatever you want. If we don't have a reckoning about this that calls out all of those schmucks with their signs on their lawns and their avatars in government, then we are going to have Trump and Trump 2 and Trump 3. And yeah, some of them are going to be idiots and deniers and twits. But that's what we get, right? For elevating these so-called experts who believe in themselves, these Faucis, above the population of the United States, and who think that, the Swedes are stupid.
That was a barn burner. You guys are both more optimistic than I am, which is unusual. I try to be a pretty, put a good face on things, but I just foresee the kind of mentality that you described, Danny, this technocratic, very haughty and dismissive approach as being something that is still pretty much in fashion on the Democratic left, certainly on the progressive left, but there just doesn't seem to be much of an appetite for reflection on that issue. Returning briefly before we go to very crass electoral politics, I think it was Danny who had mentioned RFK Jr., and there's a lot of speculation around the extent to which RFK Jr. is going to just tank this thing for Joe Biden. Like, he's in there as a spoiler. And if you look at the polling, it does suggest that Democrats are more inclined to move over to his camp, maybe just to express a level of protest and dissatisfaction with Joe Biden. But if you look at who's favoring RFK Jr. right now, it's Republicans. Republican voters really kind of like the guy, and he's pulling, national polls, he doesn't look especially prominent, but in some of the states where he's likely to get on the ballot, like Arizona, he's polling at double digits. And I want to read this quote to you from the always vexing, very frustrating, but can't miss New York Times focus groups, which just drive me absolutely insane, but I have no choice but to read them as my penance in life. One of these guys, Chris, age 50, Michigan, independent voter, white, and an educator by trade. Quote, I voted for Trump, and I voted primarily because he was a non-establishment person. And I guess there's a little bit of entertainment value, not necessarily thinking he'd get elected. All that appealed to me, just as Robert Kennedy would appeal to me now. I feel like that captures a really profound sentiment, one that is probably reflective of more voters than we think of, probably reflective of voters who are tough to poll, who are unlikely to show up at the polls, but will if they have the proper motivation to do so. And I feel like, for lack of a better term, offensive though this might be, that RFK Jr. is a magnet for the kook vote. He will absorb the kook vote. And the kook vote favors Donald Trump's campaign. It just does. And especially with the advantages associated with an incumbency and the kind of well-funded machine that Democrats can count on, the question to me remains, is RFK going to enjoy the position he enjoys only because Democrats don't spend and don't try to define him and think that they can just get away with ignoring him? Or do they spend and try to maximize his advantage among Republican voters? David.
Well, first of all, Democrats are paying attention to RFK Jr., and they're not going to just pretend he doesn't exist. The Democratic National Committee has put together a team of operatives, and very seasoned operatives, I know them, to focus strictly on third-party candidates. And right now, the most dangerous third-party candidate is RFK Jr. So that's number one. Number two, as you mentioned, right now in polling, whether it's national polling or state polling, RFK Jr. brings down the level of support for both Biden and Trump, but hurts Biden more. Now, over time, because of his appeal on the populist right, because of his position on vaccines, because of his position on military spending and corporate America, he could end up pulling more votes away from Trump than he could from Biden. And that's in part because, as you also mentioned, he appeals to the sort of voter that maybe shows up once every 20 to 25 years when there's this outsider, independent, weird, whatever you want to call it, like a Ross Perot, right? And then they won't vote again for decades because those are just the politicians from the two parties. And by the way, one of the things that has fueled Trump is that even though he's a Republican, he is one of those kinds of candidates that appeals to an otherwise low propensity voter who doesn't want to support a normal politician. Yes, he still does. Yes, he still does. The question is, will that change with another actual different kind of a candidate in the race? And we just don't know. And what we also don't know is how many states will he actually get on the ballot? And will those states be consequential? So he is supposedly on the ballot in a handful of states, and we're going to have to see how this plays out. And he's about to announce a new strategy for getting himself on the ballot in all 50 states and Washington, D.C. But this is time consuming. It takes expertise and it takes a lot of money, and time is short. And so we're just going to have to see how much of a spoiler he can be.
So David thinks I'm wrong, Danny, but my assumption here is that the kind of voter who who's previously not turned out for Donald Trump doesn't get enthused for Donald Trump now that he is, as we've been saying this whole hour, the establishmentarian guy. How do you get enthused if you're one of these people who says, the two parties are worthless, they're all the same? If Donald Trump is now the head of this party, he's stacked the Republican National Committee behind him. He's been president before. He's got the air of an institutionalist behind him, insofar as he possibly can. How does he appeal to that particular voter? That's his strategy, right? Donald Trump has to do one of two things: convince people who voted against him to vote for him, which is a high psychological hurdle to clear, or remake the electorate a la 2016 and bring out all these low propensity voters. And he has to make sure they don't go over to people like RFK Jr.
So I see it 98 different ways, most of which don't agree with the way you framed this.
Please, contradict me.
So I saw two numbers today, and I, first of all, suck at math. So both of you don't shame me. It was interesting to me. I saw that 0.5% of Trump, 0.05% of Trump voters from 2020 said they would move over to Biden, and 0.09% of Biden voters said they would move over to Trump. Now, again, we're talking about a sliver. On the other hand, state by state by state, slivers make a big difference. And this is why we're paying attention to RFK, right? It's not because he's going to get 20% of the vote like Ross Perot. He's not going to be a Ross Perot. I mean, my guess is ultimately he hurts Trump more because I think he's such a crank, and I think he pulls the crank vote. For me, the big question about this election is the unbelievable not 0.09 or 0.05 number, but the one that actually a Danny Pletka crap at math can understand, which is the 60 to 65% of voters who say they don't want to vote for either of these guys. Right? You've never had a more propitious environment for a third party. And yet you've got these losers out there, right? You've got Jill Stein. I mean, lady God, go get a freaking job at Starbucks or something. And you've got RFK, who is a shill for the worst people in the world, a vaccine crank. Just yuck. I mean, yuck, yuck, and yuck. And third, and no labels, which has been dangling itself out there in front of all of us as the good guys, the normal guys, right? We're going to be the Nikki Haley of the third party. We're going to be the Joe Manchin of the third party. There's no better year for these people. And in this year, they can't step up with somebody the three of us have heard of. This, for me, is actually one of the biggest messages about American politics, which is, what is wrong with us? Why are we so married to the Republican Democratic parties that we can't find somebody else out there? That is,
well, that's what it speaks to, doesn't it? I mean,
it
the
does.
absolute paralyzing fear of the prospect of being called a spoiler for one party or the other. If you're a third party candidate and you're deferring to the notion that, well, we can't be called a spoiler for one of the two parties, then you're a bi-party guy. You're a two-party guy. If you
Noah, the other,
can I ask you two a question, because you two know more about this than I do. I thought about Nikki Haley. Okay, yeah, we've got sore loser laws, but they'd go the way they're unconstitutional, whatever. Is she going to be the candidate in 2028? Is there any way that
she does not represent the majority faction within the Republican coalition right now, and that is her problem when it comes to looking at 2028. The issue, and Danny, you bring up such a good question. This is probably the best market for a third party or independent candidate we have had in a long time. The problem, by the way, the problem No Labels is having is they cannot find anybody willing to risk their political career on doing it, right? Because if you want to find a candidate who is compelling, credentialed, and can garner news media attention, right? So that you have a chance to raise money and put together a sort of quasi-party and infrastructure so that you have a chance to actually win and not just be a spoiler. That kind of person is not just anybody. So unless you have a charismatic billionaire businessman or woman that can come along, write big checks, and do all the things I just described, you need some politician that currently exists in the other two parties, and nobody's willing to take a flyer on their career. If they're ambitious, if they think they're going somewhere, they have not concluded that the two parties have failed, and they keep saying no.
Yeah, I'll only add that something interesting that Nikki Haley was saying towards the end of her presidential run, and I'm paraphrasing it, but it stuck out at me, was that, and she was behaving like somebody who didn't believe they had much of a future in Republican politics, but she had said something to the effect of responding to, why aren't you dropping out? There's no pathway for you. That if she cared about the future of her career, that she would not be doing what she's doing, which you would think would render her somebody who is amenable to a third party run. But
right?
But it would also, it's more than just, I don't care about my future in Republican politics. That is your future in politics, period. And possibly even your future in the private sector, at least at a certain level of the C-suite level that she's looking for. So, yeah, I mean, like we said initially, if you're afraid of offending one of the two parties, you're a binary party kind of person. And that's just the nature of our politics. I don't see that changing, unfortunately. Certainly not anytime soon. That is unfortunately going to be all the time that we have. I want to thank my guests so much for helping me navigate these issues, David Drucker and Danielle Pletka. You can find David Drucker at David M. Drucker on Twitter X, or you can read him at the Dispatch. You should. You can also find Danielle Pletka, D. Pletka, at D. Pletka. You can read her at AEI, and you can also go download the What the Hell is Going On podcast. You should. And as always, I'm Noah Rothman. You can read me on National Review at nationalreview.com, or you can read my social media posts at Noah C. Rothman. As always, thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next week.